This is the service tax from Select Casebook. Delhi Chit Fund Association versus Union of India. Can service tax be levied on the services rendered in connection with a chit fund business? Can service tax be levied on the services rendered in connection with a chit fund business? The High Court inferred that since a chit fund business, the subscription is tendered in any one forms of money as defined under section 65B33. It would be a transaction in money and would fall in the exclusionary part of the definition. Otherwise also, in view of the explanation 2, read along with the exclusionary part, the services rendered by the foreman of the chit business for which a separate consideration is charged would be out of the clutches of the definition. Thus, either way, the services of a foreman of a chit business do not constitute a taxable service. Consequently, the High Court quashed notification number 26/2012 dated 20 June 2012 to the extent of the entry in serial number 8 thereof. High Court inferred that since in chit fund business, the subscription is tendered in any one forms of money as defined under section 6533, it would be a transaction in money and would fall in the exclusionary part of definition. Otherwise also, in view of explanation 2, read with along with the exclusionary part, the services rendered by the foreman of the chit business for which a separate consideration is charged would be out of the clutches of the definition. Thus, either way, the services of a foreman of a chit business do not constitute a taxable service. Consequently, the High Court quashed notification number 26/2012 dated 20 June 2012 to the extent of the entry in serial number 8 thereof. राष्ट्रीय इस्पात निगम लिमिटेड वर्सेस दीवान चंद राम सरन. राष्ट्रीय इस्पात निगम लिमिटेड versus Diwan Chand Ram Saran. Can the service tax liability created under law be shifted by virtue of clause in the contract entered into between the service provider and the service recipient? The Supreme Court observed that on reading the agreement between the parties, it could be inferred that service provider had accepted the liability to pay service tax, since it arose out of the discharge of its obligations under the contract. With regard to the submission of shifting of service tax liability, the Supreme Court held that service tax is an indirect tax which may be passed on. Thus, SEC can contract to shift its liability. The Finance Act 1994 is relevant only between SSCs and the tax authorities and is irrelevant in determining rights and liabilities between service provider and service recipient as agreed in a contract between them. There is nothing in law to prevent them from entering into agreement regarding burden of tax arising under the contract between them. किशोर केएस वर्सेस चेरथाला म्यूनिसिपालिटी 2011. किशोर केएस वर्सेस चेरथाला म्यूनिसिपालिटी 2011. In case where rooms have been rented out by municipality, can it pass the burden of service tax to the service receivers, that is tenants? In case where the rooms have been rented out by municipality, can it pass the burden of service tax to the service receivers, that is tenants? Kishore KS versus Cherthala. The High Court rejected. The High Court rejected the contentions of the SSC observed as under. As regards to the conditions that there was no mention of service tax liability in the contract, the court held that this is a statutory right of the service provider municipality by virtue of which the provisions under the law to pass it on to the tenants. It is another matter that they made not to pass it on fully or partly. It is not open to the petitioners to challenge the validity of the demand of service tax, in view of the fact that service tax is an indirect tax and the law provides that it can be passed on to the beneficiary. Hence, the service tax can be passed on by the service provider, that is municipality. The word state in Article 289 does not impress within its scope the municipalities. Hence, when service tax is levied on the municipalities, there is no violation of Article 289. Moreover, municipality has also not raised the contention that there was a violation of Article 289. The High Court held that municipality can pass on the burden of service tax to the tenants. Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanam's Tirupati versus Superintendent of Customs Central Excise. Whether the activity of running guest houses for the pilgrims is liable to service tax. The High Court observed that as per erstwhile section 65 105 triple Z 4ZW of the Finance Act 1994, service provided to any person by a hotel, inn, guest house, club, or campsite by whatever name called for providing of accommodation for continuous period of less than 3 months is a taxable service. Therefore, the High Court held that since the petitioner was running guest houses by whatever name called, whether it was a shelter of pilgrims or any other name, it was providing the taxable services and thus is liable to pay service tax. Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanams. Infotech Software Dealers Association ISODA versus Union of India. Can a software be treated as goods, and if so, whether it's supplied to a customer as per an end user license agreement would be treated as sale or service? Can a software be treated as goods, and if so, whether it's supplied to a customer as per an end user license agreement would be treated as sale or service? The High Court held that though the software is goods, the transaction may not amount to sale in all cases, and it may vary depending on the terms of EULA, that is, End User License Agreement. Can a software be treated as goods, and if so, whether it's supplied to a customer as per End User License Agreement would be treated as sale or service? Infotech Software Dealers Association versus Union of India. CCE versus Nahar Industrial Enterprises Limited. Whether service tax is chargeable on the buffer subsidy provided by the government for storage of free sale sugar by the assessee, whether service tax is chargeable on the buffer subsidy provided by the government for storage of free sale sugar by the assessee. The High Court held that apparently service tax could be levied only if service storage and warehousing was provided. Nobody can provide service to himself. In the instant case, the assessee stored the house owned by him. After the expiry of storage period, he was free to sell them to the buyers of its own choice. He had stored goods in compliance with the directions of the Government of India issued under the Sugar Development Fund Act 1982. He had received subsidy not on account of service rendered to Government of India, but had received compensation on account of loss of interest, cost of insurance, etc. incurred on account of maintenance of stock. Hence, the High Court held that the act of SEC could not be called as rendering of services. Mayo College General Council versus CCEX. Mayo College General Council versus CCEX. A society running renowned schools allows other schools to use a specific name, its logo and motto, and receives a non-refundable amount and annual fee as consideration, whether this amounts to a taxable service. A society running renowned schools allows other schools to use a specific name, its logo and motto, and receives a non-refundable amount and annual fee as consideration, whether this amounts to a taxable service. The High Court held that when the petitioner permitted other schools to use their names, logo as their motto, it clearly tantamounted to providing franchise service to the said schools, and if the petitioner realized the franchise or collaboration fees from the franchise schools, the petitioner was duty bound to pay service tax to the government. Wipro Limited versus Union of India. Wipro Limited versus Union of India. Whether filing of declaration of description value, etc., of input services used in providing IT enabled service called call center BPO services exported outside India after the date of export of service will disentitle an export from rebate of service tax paid on such input services. Whether filing of declaration of description value, etc., of input services used in providing IT enabled services call center BPO services exported outside India after the date of export of service will disentitle an exporter from rebate of service tax paid on such service. The High Court noted that the appellant was also required to describe, value, and specify the amount of service tax payable on input services actually required to be used in providing taxable service to be exported. The High Court opined that except the description of the input services, the appellant could not provide the value and amount of service tax payable, as any estimation was ruled out by the use of the word actually required, and the bill invoice for the input services were received by the appellant only after the calls were attended to. Further, the High Court also observed that one-to-one matching of input services with export services was impossible, since every phone call was export of taxable service, but the invoice in respect of the input services were received only at regular intervals, that is, monthly or fortnightly. Thus, the High Court was of the view that, in the very nature of things and considering the peculiar features of the appellant's business, it was difficult to comply with the requirement prior to the date of export. Furthermore, the High Court elaborated that if particulars in declaration were furnished to service tax authorities within a reasonable time after export, along with necessary documentary evidence, and were found to be correct and authenticated, object purpose of filing of declaration would be satisfied. The High Court therefore allowed the rebate claims filed by the appellants and held that the condition of the notification must be capable of being complied with, as if it could not complied with, there would not be no purpose behind it. Whether filing of declaration of description, value, etc. of input services used in providing IT enabled service, that is call center, exported outside India after the date of export service will disentitle an exporter from rebate of service tax paid on such input service. The High Court noted that the appellant was also required to describe value and specify the amount of service tax payable on the input services actually required to be used in providing taxable service to be exported. The High Court opined that, except the description of the input service, the appellant could not provide the value and amount of service tax payable, as any estimation was ruled out by the use of the word actually required, and the bill invoice of the input services were received by the appellant only after the calls were attended to. Further, the High Court was also observed that one-to-one matching of input services with export services was impossible, since every phone call was export of taxable service, but the invoice in respect of the input service were received only after regular interval, monthly, fortnightly. Thus, the High Court was of the view that, in the very nature of things and considering the peculiar feature of the appellant's business, it was difficult to comply with the requirement prior to the date of export. Furthermore, the High Court elaborated that if particulars in declaration were furnished to service tax authorities within a reasonable time after export, along with necessary documentary evidence, and were found to be correct and authenticated, object purpose of filing of declaration would be satisfied. The High Court therefore allowed the rebate claims to be filed in the appellants and held that the condition of the notification must be capable of being complied with, as if it could not be complied with, and no purpose behind it. Intercontinental Consultants and Technocrats Private Limited versus Union of India. Whether expenditure like travel, hotel stay, transportation, and the like incurred by service provider in course of providing taxable service should be treated as consideration for taxable service and included in value for charging service tax. Whether expenditure like travel, hotel stay, transportation, and the like incurred by service provider in course of providing taxable service should be treated as consideration for taxable service and included in value for charging service tax. The High Court further observed that Rule 5, subsection 1 may also result in double taxation. If expenses like air travel tickets had been subjected to service tax, the High Court was of the view that double taxation can be imposed only when it is clearly provided for and intended. It can never be enforced by implication. The High Court therefore held that Rule 5.1 of the rules run in counter and is repugnant to Section 66 and 67 of the Act, and to the extent it is ultra vires to the Finance Act 1994. CIT versus Rajasthan and Urban Infrastructure 2013. Whether tax is to be deducted at source under Section 194J of the Income Tax Act 1961 on the amount of service tax if it is paid separately and is not included in the fees for professional services, technical services. Whether tax is to be deducted at source under Section 194J of the Income Tax Act on the amount of service tax if it is paid separately and is not included in the fees for technical services. The High Court held that uh, If, as per the terms of agreement between the payer and the payee, the amount of service tax is to be paid separately and is not included in the fees of professional services or technical services, the service tax component would be subject to TDS under Section 194J of the Income Tax Act 1961. ACL Education Center Limited versus Union of India. Is Rule 5A2 of the Service Tax Rules 1994 ultra vires the Finance Act? The High Court held that Section 5A2 is not ultra vires. It is in consonance with Section 72 PA of the Finance Act 1994. Chitra Builders Private Limited versus Additional Commissioner of CCE. Is it justified to recover service tax during search without passing appropriate assessment order? Is it justified to recover service tax during search without passing appropriate assessment order? The court observed that it is a well settled position in law that no tax can be collected from the SSE without an appropriate assessment order being passed by the authority concerned and by following the procedures established by law. However, in the present case, no such procedures had been followed. Further, although department had stated that the said amount had been paid voluntarily by petitioner in respect of service tax liability, it had failed to show that the petitioner was actually liable to pay service tax. Thus, the High Court elucidated that the amount collected by department from the petitioner during the search conducted could not be held to be valid in the eye of law, and directed the department to run to the petitioner the sum of 2 crores collected from it during the search conducted. Infinity Infotech Spark Limited versus Union of India. Can extended period of limitations be invoked for mere contravention of statutory provisions without the intent to evade service tax being proved? Can extended period of limitation be invoked for mere contravention of statutory provisions without the intent to evade service tax being proved? The High Court held that mere contraventions of provisions of Chapter 5 of rules framed thereunder does not enable the service tax authorities to invoke the extended period of limitation. The contravention necessarily has to be with the intent to evade the payment of service tax. Kandra Ramesh Babu Naidu versus Superintendent. Kandra Ramesh Babu Naidu. Would service tax collected but not deposited prior to 10/5/2013 be taken into consideration while calculating the amount of Rs 50 lakh as contemplated by Clause 2 of Section 89 of Finance Act 1994? The High Court held that since the said offence is continuing offence, entire amount of service tax outstanding which is required to be deposited with the central government as on 10/5/2013 would be taken into consideration while calculating the amount of Rs 50 lakhs as contemplated by Section 89 2 of the Finance Act 1994. NBC Corporation Limited versus Commissioner of Service Tax. Whether best judgment assessment NBC Corporation Limited. Whether best judgment assessment under Section 72 of the Finance Act 1994 is an ex parte assessment procedure. The High Court held that Section 72 could be per se not be considered as an ex parte assessment procedure as ordinarily understood under the Income Tax Act 1961. Section 72 mandates that the SSE must appear and must furnish books of account, documents, and material to the Central Excise Officer before he passes the best judgment assessment order. Thus, said order is not akin to an ex parte order. Such an order will be akin to an ex parte order when the SSE fails to produce records and the Central Excise Officer has to proceed on other information or data which may be available. CCE and ST versus Adeco Flexion Workforce Solution Limited 2012. Whether penalty is payable even if service tax and interest has been paid before issue of the so-called notice. The Karnataka High Court held that the authorities had no authority to initiate proceedings for recovery of penalty under Section 76 when the taxpayer paid service tax along with interest for delayed payments promptly. As per Section 73, subsection 3, no notice shall be served against persons who had paid tax with interest. Authorities can initiate proceedings against defaulters who had not paid tax and not to harass persons who had paid tax with interest on their own. If the notices were issued contrary to this section, the person who had issued notice should be punishable and not the person to whom it was issued. Wow. CCE versus KVR construction. Can an amount paid under the mistaken belief that the service is liable to service tax when the same is actually exempt be considered as service tax paid? The High Court of Karnataka distinguished the landmark judgment by Supreme Court in the case of Mafatlal Industries versus Union of India, relating to refund of duty tax, held that service tax paid mistakenly under construction service, although actually exempt, is payment made without authority of law. Therefore, mere payment of amount would not make it service tax payable by the SSC. The High Court opined that once there was lack of authority to collect such service tax from the SSC, it would not give authority to the department to retain such amount and validate it. Further, provision of Section 11B of Central Excise Act 1944 applied to a claim refund of excise duty service tax only and could not be extended to any other amounts collected without authority of law. In view of the above, the High Court held that the refund of an amount mistakenly paid as service tax could not be rejected on ground of limitation under Section 11B of the Central Excise Act 1944. Ankleshwar Taluka versus ONGC Land Losers Travelers Company. Ankleshwar Taluka ONGC Land Losers Travelers Company versus CCE. In case where the SSE has acted bona fide, can penalty be imposed for the delays in payment of service tax arising on account of confusion regarding tax liability and divergent views due to conflicting court decisions? In case where the SSE had acted bona fide, can penalty be imposed for the delay in payment of service tax arising on account of confusion regarding tax liability and divergent views due to conflicting court decisions? The High Court held that even if the appellants were aware of the levy of service tax and were not paying the amount on the ground of dispute with the ONGC, there could be no justification in levying the penalty in absence of any fraud, misrepresentation, collusion, or willful misstatement or suppression. Moreover, when the entire issue for levying of tax was debatable, that would also surely provide legitimate grounds not to impose the penalty. CCE versus ST Bangalore versus Dell Intel Services India Private Limited. Can the Committee of Commissioners review its decision taken earlier under Section 86(2)(a) of the Finance Act 1994 at the instance of Chief Commissioner? The Karnataka High Court held that once the Committee of Commissioners, on a careful examination of the order of Commissioner, did not differ in their opinion against the said order of the Commissioner and decide to accept the said order, the matter end here. The said decision is final and binding on the Chief Commissioner also. The Chief Commissioner is not vested with any power to call upon the meeting commissioners to review its order so as there would take decision to prefer an appeal. Such procedure is not contemplated under law and without jurisdiction.